Hi, everybody. We're here to give you a topic analysis on the September-October topic. We're going to try to go through things not super quickly, but we want to open the floor for question and answers at the end, so that way you can actually, digest the things that you're hearing and ask about things that are applicable to what you are writing. So try to hold your questions for the end, but if anything is super unclear, feel free to just raise your hand and ask us to clarify for you. Alright, so topic is resolved. In the United States, colleges and universities ought not consider standardized tests in undergraduate admissions decisions. And we have a timeline of standardized education, specifically standardized testing in the context of education. It's really important for y'all to pay attention to the history in particular, because it'll inform why some of the arguments that we're talking about make sense, especially for those of you who are thinking about going into some of the critical literature. A lot of moments in history are going to indicate why scholars are probably making the arguments that they are making. So try to catch what you can.
Right. So, back in the olden days, we really basically had assessment-based tests which would be used to figure out who did well enough in the public school system that they could then go on to college. And so it was really like in the same way you have to pass tests in order to move past elementary school and into middle school, or pass tests to move from middle school into high school. So there were just sort of tests that you would pass in order to move into college. But these tests were not written, they were mostly oral examinations, because that's what they did. I actually don't know why. But then there was this shift, because in the continent, over in Europe and in the UK, they were starting to use written tests, right? Like Oxford and Cambridge were using written tests. And that was cool and impressive. And so American educational entrepreneurs were like, we should be using written tests. And in Massachusetts in particular, the Secretary of Massachusetts, Horace Mann, that's right. I definitely know what's the content of the slide. Horace Mann decided that we needed to have these written tests that imitated the European model, and that would then be used as people were finishing up secondary education, public education, which would then be used as an assessment mechanism to see who got to move on to college-level work. This was instituted across the state of Massachusetts, which was the first really standardized test used in the United States. At the same time, no, not at the same time, 50 years later, so very different time, Harvard President Charles William Eliot proposed a cooperative system of common entrance examinations for all professional schools, which began the first instance of which a school tried to institute certain standardized tests for admission decisions. And a couple of years later, we began to see the increase in scientific measurements of assessment. So we began to see the growth of sort of proto or preliminary types of IQ tests and things of that sort. And one of the big people who was starting with this was Thorndike, who began some of the first scientific measures of assessment. Note, at this point, though, we're still really assessing how much students know, how they've done in subjects, and not yet at the sort of aptitude-based examinations that we're going to get to a little later on.
And then in the 20th century is when a lot of things start happening in the context of standardized testing. So right at the beginning of the 20th century, we see the College Entrance Examination Board that is established. So that's kind of feeding off of what the Harvard president was saying in terms of all colleges and universities should use a form of examination that is uniform. Students take that test and then they use that in order to get to colleges. So this is the time we start seeing this officially. And do not confuse College Entrance Examination Board with College Board. I made this mistake until I kept doing more research. This is kind of just like the predecessor, or kind of the standard that created something along the lines that everyone in the nation should be doing a similar form of testing, but this is something that's completely separate. Then in 1901, the first examinations were administered across the country in 9 subjects. So that's the first time that we see people across the United States. So if you notice from the previous slide, sometimes it was in certain states, particularly in Boston, or places where people were piloting it. But soon everybody was really on board on this, and at least people were giving it a try at the beginning of the 20th century. Then comes in French psychologist Alfred Binet, and he's really important for a lot of the kind of undercover messed up history. Even though he didn't intend for his studies to get out of control, he developed standardized testing, specifically in the context of intelligence, as a way to kind of understand and weed out students that were not fit in regular classrooms. his original intention was that we should recognize these students who don't have the same capabilities as others and apply different forms of teaching to help those students. However, Americans got wind of it and then it went crazy. So then in 1911, H.H. Goddard brings this test to the United States, and he's the one who starts convincing public schools that they should start using this type of testing to make decisions about who gets to go to their schools. And likewise, in the same year, next year, around that time, we see William Stern, who brings about the IQ test. And I'm sure like a lot of you probably have seen, maybe taken like play IQ tests or whatever, but this is kind of where it originally started, and it created this mental age. So it gave you an age based on how many things you got correct in your test, divided this by your actual age, and multiplied this by 100. And this was used to see how intelligent you were, essentially. And it wasn't just a question of what you can achieve, but rather the ability that you intrinsically have as a person. So there was no question of growth. It was more so a question of like who you were as a person and whether you were capable in terms of your intelligence. In 1916, this test is reinterpreted by this like dude at Stanford named Lewis Terman, and creates the Stanford Binet intelligence test. And this was for finding feeble-minded individuals. And this is where the US version of this test starts becoming a little bit harmful, because it was used to explicitly separate students in terms of their potential for not only educational placement, but also the careers that they would be fit to go into. Right? So you start seeing the ways in which these tests are not also determining people's future and their ability to be able to do certain things, whereas prior tests were mostly checking whether they can advance to the next level. Then in 1916, the College Board begins to develop comprehensive examinations in 6 subjects, and this is the College Board that we do recognize today. But also around this time, specifically during World War I, the same people who created the Stanford Binet test were asked to create this Alpha and Beta Army test. And this was really important because this same model was used in a bunch of schools and what piloted the ways in which we use standardized testing. And essentially all these tests we're trying to assess is how fit, how mentally capable, how intelligent these soldiers were, whether they should stay in the army or they should be discharged. And it helped them decide who they wanted to have on the battlefield. Then, in the 1930s, we start seeing multiple choice. So prior to this, sometimes there were options, right? And people can kind of add in their own answers. As we saw, written exams were things that people were starting to move forward on. But now we start seeing multiple choice tests as the most prevalent way that people are taking tests, which undermine the ability for them to like put in other answers. There's only one correct answer, and that's it. And then in the 60s, that's when you start seeing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and that required that states administer tests and send those scores back for funding. So you start seeing government involvement in the context of standard testing. So it's not just the question of it's assessment and this helps us know their future careers, but now it starts determining the outcome of the schooling itself and whether they will receive funding and continue existing. And this sets the precedent for a lot of things in the 21st century that we will talk about in a second. But during this time, not sure if it's a direct response, but definitely in conversation with it, we have a college like Bodine College declare themselves the first college to make these tests optional in terms of their admissions, which was really radical at the time. And we see it's still even kind of radical today, which is why we're talking about it in the first place. Okay. And don't worry, we'll put this on the student portal, so if you miss anything, you'll get it.
So then, moving on to the beginning of the 21st century, one of the big changes that sort of substantially accelerated the use of standardized testing was the No Child Left Behind Act. Probably some of y'all have heard. Oh, this is kind of getting cut off, isn't it?
It's the 20th century first.
We're not there yet.
Oh, my bad.
Yeah.
Good.
Oh yeah, go. Okay.
Are you,
The 20th century.
Yeah.
Continued.
Right, continued. In the 1980s, 33 states mandated a form of minimum competency testing. Over 200 million tests were administered. So in the 80s, you start seeing it really become prevalent. And by the end of the 90s, right, President Bush Sr. institutes national report cards for schools. And this sets the precedent for Bush's 2000 initiative called Educate America Act, where he uses standardized testing to legitimize whether schools should exist or not, and this creates the foundation for what goes on in the 21st century.
All right, here we go. All right. So yeah, the No Child Left Behind Act. This was passed under George Bush Jr., George W. Bush, and it was a substantial increase in the amount and use of standardized testing. Obviously, the idea, as the name suggests, is to avoid allowing kids slipping through the cracks, dropping out, etc. And so you have basically regular testing. So you'll hear the term AYP, or adequate yearly progress, being used basically as a term for making sure kids are keeping up. And so in high school, you see a large increase in standardized testing. Now, this is not exactly the sort of standardized testing you'll be talking about directly with the topic, because the topic is dealing with entrance exams, right? So SAT, ACT, things like that, we're getting into college. A lot of these exams we're talking about here are exit exams, or exams during high school to determine whether or not you want to, say, pass, go to the next grade, etc. And so the topic will not concern whether or not those exams still exist at the high school level. But what this does demonstrate is, A, sort of the increasing prevalence of standardized exams throughout the culture, and then B, there might be a possible argument about a correlation between the sort of effect that colleges using admissions exams has on high school culture, or vice versa, the sort of interplay between different forms of exams, teaching to the test, things like that. And so you should be aware, or evaluating the value or harm of entrance exams, that we also have large numbers of other forms of standardized testing at the high school level. So affirming and saying colleges shouldn't consider entrance exams would not necessarily get rid of all standardized testing in our culture, because we still have laws on the books that still require large amounts of exams. Y'all have probably taken a bunch of exams for school already, even those of you who have not taken the SAT or the ACT. And this law is going to be part of the reason why. And then just some other notable things that have happened recently. I'm sure most of you are aware the SAT reformed and then re-reformed its system. They had the 1600 level score, they went to 2400, then went back to 1600 again. A lot of that is going to deal with arguments we're about to get to, which is potential issues of bias and colleges potentially refusing to use SAT. And so SAT is like, hey, well, that's our business model. We need to make sure the test is palatable. And so they've tried to revise their system in order to account for those biases, changing the grading score, for example, to de-emphasize sort of the double counting of the writing and the verbal elements, to remove some of the questions, e.g. the complete the sentence questions that are potentially contextually ambiguous, things like that. And so some of these recent reforms are the College Board trying to get its act in shape so as to avoid getting dropped by colleges, which is the question at hand. Likewise, another significant decision, the University of Chicago, just like Bowdoin College, made their test, or their admissions test optional, which just means they don't require you to submit the test. And that's an argument we'll also discuss in a second, the short version being, could it either make the test better, or would it be even worse if rather than requiring it or prohibiting it, we just sort of meet in the middle and make it an optional consideration, but neither a mandatory nor an irrelevant one. So there's a number of tests. Is that a question?
Yeah.
Go for it.
When was the ACT created?
What's your question?
When was the ACT
The
created?
date? I do not know the date the ACT was created. I imagine Google will tell you that pretty fast if you want to check. Actually, you don't want to do that real fast and just tell us when the ACT was created.
1959.
There you go, 1959.
Previous competition for the SAT.
It was so it's a little more than just competition for the SAT. The ACT was originally created for a different purpose. The SAT was designed to demarcate students and rank them, basically, say the best students and the worst students. The ACT was instead designed for Midwestern state schools, whose goal was to accept everyone who passed a certain level of competency. And so the ACT was originally designed as an assessment for those who have mastered a certain level of high school curriculum knowledge, and then just if you pass that, the schools want to let everyone in who's done so. And so the ACT was originally designed more as an assessment of how well you did in high school, and less as a mechanism by which we can sort of rank all the students on a scale and figure out who is the best and who is the worst.
Yeah, so potential relevant tests that we could be discussing. So the obvious big two are going to be the SAT and the ACT. Many of y'all are going to take one or both of these before applying to college. The ACT is the one we were just discussing. The SAT is the other big one. This is the one that's run by the College Board. This is the one, the standardized aptitude test, that is basically measuring sort of your basic ability to do things like mathematics, reading, verbal skills, etc. And the scores will range, obviously, from 1,600 down to like very low numbers, with the average being roughly 1,000. And then the college will use that score to determine your placement. Now, other things that might also potentially be relevant. So SAT also, or the College Board also offers SAT subject tests. These are also standardized tests, but they're going to be more subject specific, e.g. taking a subject test in biology to show that you have a certain minimum level of biology knowledge, or other topics. So whereas the SAT is very broad and generalized, and is dealing with sort of your general aptitude, right? Aptitude is the A in SAT. You can also take subject tests that show particularized knowledge in a given subject matter. And then another thing that's going to be relevant is going to be advanced placement, or IB classes. Both of these are classes that you take during high school. I'm sure many of y'all have probably already taken some of these classes. And so, obviously, these things will still exist in either world because they exist at the high school level. And affirming would not make them entirely irrelevant. For example, you might still be eligible for college credit if you took an AP or IB class and you go to college, and the colleges say, this is a college level course, we will grant you college credit because you've already taken this class, and we won't require you to retake it. So for example, if you pass like AP calculus, and then you go to college, they might neglect, or they might count that as your math requirement, right? And so that could still happen either in the affirmative or the negative world. Because this topic is only dealing with admissions decisions. So AP and IB tests can still happen, they can still give you college credit. But they would potentially be relevant in terms of, can they be counted towards whether you should be let in the first place or not? And so colleges in the affirmative world, you might say, should not evaluate whether you got a 5 on your AP calculus test in the first place. If you got a 5, that can matter once you got into college for getting college credit, but they shouldn't evaluate that as evidence whether or not you should go to the college in the first place. Or if you scored well on an IB exam, that sort of thing. They can consider, oh, they took a class, they have a difficult curriculum, but they shouldn't weight the tests, the AP tests, as part of the decision. And so that's another example of standardized test. And then 2 last ones. These probably deal primarily with international students, but the TOEFL is for speakers of other languages to test English proficiency. Obviously, most of y'all probably will not need to take that, but a lot of foreign students coming to the United States to go to school in U.S. colleges will have to show a basic level of English proficiency, and so they will take a standardized test of their English knowledge. And then, likewise, many colleges will also accept standardized exams of other countries. Many other countries have their own standardized exams, and so you'll find that some universities will accept certain levels of scores from other countries' exams. And so, obviously, if the topic requires us not to consider standardized exams writ large, then that would obviously apply to U.S. colleges considering non-U.S. exams as well. That's going to be like marginal number of students in terms of the total body of students, but that's just potentially relevant.
So, given this wide variety of tests, it's useful to have a simple way to break them down and how you think about them. And in general, most of these tests fall somewhere on a spectrum between being pure aptitude tests and pure achievement tests. Aptitude tests are designed to say what your learning potential is going forward, and achievement tests are supposed to say how much have you learned up to this point. So IQ tests were the quintessential form of a supposed aptitude test. They weren't supposed to differentiate for how well you've been trained up to this point, but instead assess some sort of raw natural intelligence which you have as a stable, enduring trait no matter how well you've been educated up to that point. In contrast, achievement tests are the classic achievement test is, the test that you take at the end of a class, which is just like all the content knowledge you learned during your second year of high school history. And it's just, do you know the information that was conveyed? There will be no way for you to reason your way to these sort of answers. Things like the English as a second language test are achievement-based tests. It's not asking how well will you be able to learn English, it's saying, do you know English? While the classic SAT test was an aptitude test. One thing to note is that the SAT seems to be moving, especially over the last decade or so, maybe even 2 decades, from being a predominantly aptitude-based test to being an increasingly, they kind of say they're an assessment test and kind of say they're an aptitude test and no one really knows. So, for instance, they dropped the word aptitude from their name. So, in fact, SAT, according to College Board, no longer stands for anything. It used to stand for something. It now is no longer acronym. It is no longer an acronym. It just is SAT. And this is because they no longer claim to be an aptitude test. Instead, they claim to be more like an assessment of the critical thinking skills you learned through high school. So it's not supposed to be any particular content knowledge that you've learned, but just how well have you learned to think. So they kind of play this middle ground between assessment and aptitude tests. This is mostly relevant because there's actually a good number of authors who give reasons why achievement tests or aptitude tests are better or worse on a whole range of metrics. And so there's lots of arguments you can make for why the affirmative criticisms of tests are really criticisms of aptitude tests or really criticism of achievement tests, but standardization of the other one is still an effective way to make admissions decisions.
Now, another relevant consideration for evaluating the topic is just asking what the goals of college admission should be in the first place. This will probably inform a lot of the frameworks y'all create. And one that I think probably a lot of y'all students just sort of implicitly think of as like the goal of college admissions is just like, if I do well, I deserve to go to a good school. And the idea that sort of being admitted is the reward for all the work that you put in. And I mean, one could conceive of it that way, one could perhaps make arguments for that conclusion. But realistically, that's probably not a whole lot to do with how the system really works, right? The colleges aren't just like, we're like the Santa Clauses of the education system, handing out rewards to the good children, right? They have their own motivations, be they good or ill, but they're not just doing this impartially as just like a beneficent gift to the students, right? So more likely you'll see sort of three baskets of reasons. First might be the benefits for the students. So for example, one reason that they might want to test is because they want to test your readiness to perform in college. You'll see that a lot of studies on this topic deal with whether SAT, ACT, other scores like that can predict your success during college. Like, do they correlate well to your grades, to dropout rates, things like that. And so it might be that colleges care about these tests because they want to know, are you ready to learn, right? Will college be useful for you? And so that is potentially a benefit to the student. And then likewise, you might also have a broader impact of, not just to your education, but would admitting you be helpful to the student body? So things like leadership skills, communication abilities, the sort of broader values that you might think that are indicative of a good student, they might value those not just because it shows that you're a good learner, but it shows that you would be a positive contribution to the college atmosphere, to your classmates, etc. They want a community of individuals who can participate, discuss things, learn from each other, etc. And so a lot of values in terms of what you bring to the school might be in terms of your education value to other students, things like that. And so you find that part of the reason colleges might weight somewhat intangible skills is because it brings a better atmosphere or a college culture, right? A student who can discuss things critically is beneficial not just to themselves in learning, but to other students around them because they're enhancing the educational atmosphere for everybody. A second basket of issues might be the broader effect on society. So for example, one big issue that you'll hear a lot of this topic is how standardized test admissions can affect social equity and inclusion. And we're going to get into the particulars of that in a moment when we get to affirmative arguments. But you'll see that potential criticisms on both sides relate to, do these increase or decrease the inclusivity of the college environment? E.g., are they recreating or enforcing racial, gender, disability-related lines, or are they helping to break those down? And so this is more of a broader benefit to society as a whole, right? You want to decrease stereotypes and not reinforce them. And so you might see this broader societal issue of any of these various forms of social discrimination that colleges need to consider in their admission process to make sure that they're not holding those. And the second benefit might just be colleges' value is not just to help that individual be educated to like make themselves more money, but to help that individual be educated to benefit society writ large. And so you might think things like the broader liberal arts education, civics education, etc., is good not just for that student, but for society as a whole, because we want an educated, participatory citizenry, because they're going to go out and make informed decisions when they're voting, be a helpful member of society, contribute responsibly, etc. And so you might think that education is in some sense a public good, which just means that it is a good that benefits everybody, not just the person who receives it. And so part of the value of college is making sure that they are maximizing the educational potential of students, is that they are trying to increase your benefit to society as a whole. And then a third basket of issues just relates to the benefit to the college. And so one thing that universities realistically are probably doing to some degrees, some a lot, some a little, whether they admit it or not, is they're restrictive in admissions because it benefits them, right? So one aspect of this is going to be they want to maintain a brand, right? If you're a university, your goal is to make sure students want to apply there, to make sure you can hit the necessary quotas to fill up your admissions, right? You have a certain number of students you want to admit, and you need applications. And what happens is if you admit students, say, that drop out, students that bring down your overall performance or bring down your prestige, future groups of students aren't going to apply. People aren't going to donate because they dropped out rather than going to become successive business people, etc. And so you might care about students' performance insofar as it benefits you as a university, right? You want potentially successful kids because it reflects well on your college. And so part of what might be going on in admissions decisions is colleges are considering what students are beneficial to the colleges in the first place, right? Which students are going to perform well long term, build a name for that school, become alumni, donate back to the school, make other students want to come to that school because they're seeing all the famous business people are coming from this business program, or they're saying all the famous actors are coming from this particular school for performing arts, that sort of thing. Relatedly, a term that you'll hear a lot in discussion of colleges is signaling, which is a question as to sort of what the value of college is for the students. And so in one theory, the reason you go to college is because you learn a lot, right? You learn more, you become a smarter person, and that helps you later in life. And a lot of these arguments sort of presuppose that. But another potential value of college is just that it acts as a good signal, right? If you got into an Ivy League school, right, or you on the West Coast, you got into Berkeley or Stanford, right? Independent of how much you learned in that school, that degree itself is just going to be valuable because it shows that you were admitted into a highly selective college and you succeeded. And so that degree itself just sort of signals that you were already an educated person, already someone who was going to succeed. And so part of the value of colleges might just be their degree itself, their admission itself is worth something. Irrespective of what they teach you, it's just sort of a selective club that you're now a part of. And so insofar as part of the, and you'll see studies on like how much of the value of college is signaling, some say a lot, some say little. But insofar as part of the value of college is just the signal that it sends, like I'm the person who's able to get accepted here and then pass here, then colleges might have a strong reason to care about selectivity, because if their value comes from being a selective institution, then they might need to maintain some degree of selectivity for their business model to even function. And that leads to sort of two related, very values-related questions. First is, to what degree do colleges need to prioritize the public good, impartial societal goods over their interests? One line of thinking might go, there's a lot of colleges out there, right? They're fighting neck and neck. It's in a free market. If one college just decides to be fully impartial, care about the common good, and not prioritize their own long-term interests, they're just going to lose out to the other colleges that are more profit-oriented, that beat them out, that care more about their own interests, and then overtake them in rankings, overtake them in long-term prospects, etc. And so colleges, like a corporation, might just need to look out for themselves. Remember, a lot of colleges are, in fact, private colleges, right? And so you might argue that colleges, just by the nature of being in a very competitive market, need to make sure they're making financially responsible decisions. Not just, in the abstract sense for their, the top-end people, but also it might be harmful to the students or to the alumni if that college ends up folding. Now, a second line of argument, though, is that a college needs to care about society as a whole. For example, colleges, basically all public and private colleges, are registered as non-profit organizations. There's exceptions, right? You've probably heard of some of the for-profit colleges. Those usually have a bad rap. But colleges are in general registered as non-profit organizations, which means legally they're tax exempt. They have special benefits from the government, like not having to pay taxes and other things like that. Which means you might think that the reason they're getting those special benefits and privileges is the government has deemed this, like this educational aspect, to be valuable to society, and that confers on the college some obligation to produce a good that's beneficial to society, more so than your average private business would. So even in a ostensibly private college, by virtue of being a nonprofit, might have a particular legal or moral obligation to care about the broader societal ramifications of its decisions, and care about broader values like promoting civic engagement, and not just promoting the bottom line. And so that's a relevant question. And then the second basket of questions is, to what degree do they need to concern themselves with fairness, right? Is it, in some sense, unfair if they choose one group of students or one student over another? And so one line of thinking would go, again, colleges are selective, they're individual institutions, there's lots of colleges to go for. There's no one reason that, say, Columbia needs to just choose exactly all the best kids and none of the worst kids, because there's tons of good colleges out there. Kids that didn't get accepted could go elsewhere. And Columbia could just decide, we have a particular educational model in mind, a particular type of student we're looking for. We're going to select these kids because we're an institution that can choose voluntarily who we want to admit, who we don't want to admit. And there's nothing unfair about an institution saying, we're going to choose particular kids and not others, because it's ultimately up to them. You have no entitlement to go to the private institution that is Columbia University. Another line of thinking might go that, part of the, again, one might go back to the public interest, that they have a basic obligation of fundamental fairness because they're allegedly a neutral public good for society. Or maybe even just perceptually, the sort of value of college as being a respected academic institution might require that they be perceived as fair, because if the process for getting admitted looks more arbitrary, that might also undermine the value of the degree itself. Now we're going to jump into some stock affirmative arguments. These are the sort of two core sets of affirmative arguments that you'll see on the topic. The first is the set of arguments related to biases of the test. So why might these tests be poor indicators of whether you're going to perform well in college or in life? And these arguments are relevant because obviously if the purpose of a test is to give the college additional information that you're going to succeed, and then it does the opposite of that. It gives bad or incorrect information, and it could proactively decrease the results. Now note that the burden here is a little bit large because even if the test only gives like a little bit of information, as long as the information was net positive, it could still be a good thing. And so what you want to show here is essentially that the test is useless or that it's counterproductive, and then it gives sort of proactively, what's the word I'm looking for? Skewed signals, right? And so here's a number of the ways it can do that. So the first is that it can create sort of, especially along racial, gender, or disability lines, skews based on stereotypes. And there's a decently large body of literature, and you'll see this term used a lot, called stereotype threat, that shows that students who fall into historically disadvantaged categories, e.g., if you fall into a racial minority, or if you are female, or if you have a particular learning disability, then you go into a standardized test, you're likely to perform worse, irrespective of your general academic attainment, simply because you sort of often feel the additional pressure to perform to reflect positively on your entire social group, whereas someone who is not in one of the disadvantaged categories doesn't feel that additional pressure. So a way a lot of these studies are conducted is they'll do something like this. They'll take two sets of students, so like one set of, say, white and black students and another set of white and black students, or a set of male and female students and another one. And they tell one of these sets, hey, we just had this nifty experiment, and we want to take you, give us like an hour of your time, do this experiment, so we can learn stuff. And then another one, they say, we're taking this experiment to determine like your level of intelligence and how it reflects compared to the intelligence of your peers, right? So exact same test, but in one case they're being told, hey, your result of this test is being used to determine basically your overall intelligence. And in that latter case, the students who were part of the disadvantaged minority group performed worse, and the hypothesis is that the reason they're performing worse is because they feel this additional pressure, the stereotype threat of conforming to a negative stereotype. And so even if they would perform perfectly fine in the low intensity environment, the sort of stress-inducing, high-pressure environment can exacerbate existing stereotypes, and that might create a bias. A second one might be socioeconomic disparities. Obviously, these tests are trying to be a measure of intelligence, but as with anything in society, they're not entirely neutral or objective, and so people who already have access to more resources can in some ways game the tests, e.g. paying money for test prep services in order to learn how the tests work, or taking the test multiple times, which a poor student could not because they don't have the money to take it multiple times, and they have the time because they work a second job, things like that. And so you might argue that people who are already wealthy have a disparate advantage in terms of being, learning how the test works, which is independent of how good they are academically in general. And so that creates a perverse incentive for rich people to game the test in a way that gives them an artificial advantage. And then a third category might be related to disability. Now we mentioned disability earlier already in terms of the stereotype threat, but a separate concern might just be disabilities that affect your ability to take a test in a test-taking environment. E.g., if you have physical disabilities that need to be accounted for in a test-taking environment, or learning disabilities that require you to, say, spend longer on a test, or process information slower, things like that, might not reflect on your general intelligence, but they might reflect on your ability to, answer 40 multiple-choice questions in 35 minutes, right? And so you wouldn't want necessarily, say, someone who's very intelligent, but not good at test-taking because of a cognitive or physical disability. Maybe they can't write well, so they're bad at the essay, to score poorly, because in society in general, they'd be a very productive individual. It's just in the very particular, sort of not very real-world setting of a standardized exam, they perform artificially badly. And obviously, tests do, to some degree, try to accommodate for these, but you might argue just sort of inherently the process might be inefficient. Then a fourth form of sort of bias that you might find is that some people criticize the test for overly valuing analytic thinking, sort of logical mathematical analysis, and devaluing sort of creative or the non-cognitive skills. So maybe your benefit to society is you're a very good painter, you're very creative, you come up with abstract ideas very well. It's kind of hard to test that in a multiple choice section, or write that in an argumentative essay. And so one argument I make is these people are, the creative thinkers of the world, are intelligent in ways that are very relevant to the college's goals, e.g. they're likely to succeed in life, they're likely to contribute to the student body, etc. But those sorts of skills cannot be summed up in a test, which makes the test a poor measure of a student's overall academic ability. And then finally is linguistic biases. This one I think seems pretty obvious. The tests are presented in English, so if you're an English speaker of another language, you might do worse on that test simply because it takes you longer to parse out each of the sentences to quit meaning the words. You might be very good at math, but if you have to interpret that and sort of translate that before you do it, you might do worse simply by virtue of having less time, things like that. Now, there's also a second basket of linguistic biases, which is you might be a speaker of English, but you might, for example, not be familiar with the sort of English that is used in the test. A common criticism you'll see with a lot of standardized tests is that it's written in a particular dialect, a particular version of standardized English, that some students are better at than others. So for example, if the examples used, use things like sailing or skiing, right? Wealthy individuals are going to do well in that. And say poor people, minority groups, etc., that have different life experiences might relate less well to those examples, or they might have a different vernacular or vocabulary. That means questions written in a neutral form of English, in fact, privilege a particular dialect that might disadvantage students who, say, speak a different dialect of English. And so you also find evidence that suggests the questions, simply like the words they use, the passages they prioritize, the examples they use for some of the verbal questions are not actually neutral descriptors of can you speak well, but actually can you speak a certain dialect well. And you could argue that maybe that sort of bias is an illicit bias that gives students an arbitrary disadvantage. Now, the second set of affirmative arguments deals with the harms of the test itself. So irrespective of the accuracy, you can argue that there are harms caused by the taking of the test. So one of those is just every time you take a test, there's a large amount of cost you need to invest as a student. It takes a lot of your time to study for the test, to go spend hours of your life driving the test, taking the test, etc., taking time out of your day. It costs a lot of money, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware. A lot of these do have, reduced cost programs, but even in that case, you might be spending some money, or you might just have difficulty accessing it in the first place. And so every time you take a test, it costs time, energy, money, etc. And if there's some sort of inherent cost, requiring millions of children every year to take time and money to the tune of millions of dollars, and this is a multi-million-dollar industry to do this, then there needs to be some strong productive benefit. And so as the affirmative, you could argue that these sort of inherent costs every time you take a test set a very proactive burden on the test to be successful. And so unless the test is very useful or necessary for admissions, then we shouldn't be imposing this large, consistent, fixed cost on students every single year if it has speculative benefits in terms of increasing college admission accuracy. And second potential harm is teaching to the test. So this refers to the idea that if you give a test that's purported to be neutral, but it has predictable characteristics, e.g. you ask certain types of questions or consistently ask them in certain ways, people will start to adapt those strategies in school and outside of school to learn how to take your test rather than just learning education that makes them smart in general. Now, this is particularly onerous in the context of exit exams, right? High school exams. And as I mentioned in the sort of historical overview, those aren't going to be directly covered by the topic, right? Teachers will often teach to the test in high school where they just teach you the answers that they think you need to learn, right? Like the question about the particular fact in U.S. history that they know is taught. Like they know they're going to ask you, who is the educational reform in the United States? And they know that you need to say Horace Mann. So they teach you to memorize the word Horace Mann because they know that'll be on the exam, right? That's going to be the most pernicious form of teaching to the test, where they teach you the information you want to know. Now, that doesn't necessarily exist in the context of some of these entrance exams, because things like the ACT and the SAT are more abstract. They're more in the aptitude direction rather than teaching particular content knowledge, but it can still exist. One way it can still exist is teaching you the sort of types of questions, right? Teachers might prioritize multiple choice questions. They might prioritize particular forms, like if they know that the SAT had sentence completion, which up until recently it did, they might give you sentence completion questions. They give you test-taking skills, right? I remember taking an entire class in high school that was called study skills. So it was basically how to take tests well, things like that. And so you might argue that these sorts of things pervert educational institutions because you spend time learning how to take tests rather than learning actually valuable information. And so having a predictable, preset set of questions or style of asking questions causes people to take time out of their day, distort actual engaging teaching environments, like having more, hands-on stuff in favor of teaching, test-taking skills. Now, affirming can't totally solve this because, as we mentioned, a lot of these tests will still exist, exit exams will still exist. But you could argue that the SAT and the ACT contribute to or compound that problem, right? They're some of the highest stakes tests, the most important tests for a lot of kids, and so that can create a perverse incentive. A second place this can occur is outside of school. So a lot of people, pay for test prep courses, things like that. And to some degree, you might just be actually learning a lot, right? Maybe you're just taking, you're learning more vocabulary outside of school. That's a good thing. That should be reflected in a test. But one of the problems you might have is some of these sort of test-taking, programs are not imparting you just like genuine knowledge. It's not teaching you to like, actually be better at math or actually be better at vocabulary, which would be a valuable education, but they're at the same time or predominantly teaching you how to deal with a test-taking environment. They're giving you practice tests to get you used to taking tests. They're teaching you the nature of SAT questions, strategies for allocating time, right? These things are skills that are only useful for test taking. And so you could argue that test taking causes this perverse incentive for students, parents, etc., to waste large amounts of time and money on essentially useful services to learn how to take tests for the sake of taking this test. And if that doesn't approach value, then we couldn't justify that. And the final cost, you might argue, is just the sort of emotional or psychological impact on students, both before and after the test. Before the test, obviously, you have large amounts of anxiety, right? Worry about that test. You argue that's bad for students' emotional well-being, their ability to do well in school, things like that. And then after the test, you might argue that students sort of, when their value or their ability into college is reduced in part to a number, they might overly value that, and having a low score could, for example, negatively impact your self-esteem, things like that. So you could argue that it's sort of the process of reductively assessing a student by a singular test can be bad in various emotional ways for that student's mental health, both before and after the fact.
So there are a ridiculous number, as I'm sure you've seen, negative arguments on this topic. Almost all of the articles seem to negate. So we're just going to quickly run through the core ones. The first is, it turns out, according to most of the studies I've seen, that standardized tests are an incredibly or a fairly effective measure of performance in school, both in terms of the likelihood individuals will drop out and their expected college GPA. This is true even when you control for high school GPA, so there's a noticeable difference between high school GPA students who receive high SAT scores and low SAT scores in terms of college performance. There's studies that suggest this might not be as strong as it looks like, but most of the sort of really robust studies I've seen do seem to side with the negative on this question. The question that's kind of difficult for the negative is impacting out why this matters. What is the reason to think we really want highly meritocratic admissions processes? Some things you might impact out in terms of are the harms of college dropout rates, especially students who take on debt and then don't get a diploma and now are just saddled with debt without any higher earning potential. Concerns about college competitiveness, which Nails touched on earlier, and potential fairness concerns about individuals not getting to schools when they deserve to. A second related set of negative arguments about bias suggests that the alternative standardized tests might just be worse. So there's lots of really good evidence that standardized tests are biased, but there's a really good evidence that individual admission decisions, when you try to make them without any sort of standard metric, just allow all of an individual's personal biases to enter in and results in creating even more biased decisions overall. Things that will go into this are things like implicit biases, as well as the inability for a student to demonstrate ability if they had something that happened in high school that systematically affected their grades for a year. Right? If my parent had died when I was a sophomore in school, my grades would have been much, much worse, but perhaps I still could have done well on an SAT and I had no ability to indicate that higher potential aptitude. The SAT is one of the only things that eliminate outside influences. If I have a tutor at home, my tutor can help me on my math, prepare for my math classes, help me do my homework, help me write my college admissions essays, help me on my extracurriculars. I can go to a rich school which has a grade of 18, which would make me much more likely to win national championships, etc., etc. But I can't have someone take the test for me. So standardized tests are one of the only things you can just hire someone to make you do better directly. They can only train you to do better, so it might be a better proxy. Lastly, there are studies which just indicate that when you remove standardized tests, we result in more disparate and less equitable overall admission decisions. So there was like one study which tried to model what the decision procedure would look like. They gave admission decisions. Here are the portfolios to make a decision base with SAT information, without SAT information. And there were sort of minor differences. The only main difference was it seemed like more white people got admitted if you didn't have SAT stuff involved. Next thing is concerns about standardization. So obviously the standard argument for why we should have standardized tests is it allows a common standard to assess students from very different educational situations. For example, if one student is growing up in Malaysia and wants to apply to a school, and I grew up in Maryland, and Jacob Nails was somewhere in the South, we had very different educational experiences, our grades were very different. It's really, really hard to assess what would be a common way to compare the three of us. One thing you might do is create a standard mechanism by which we can actually assess what does a 3.5 mean at this school and what does a 3.5 mean at this other school and what does whatever the totally different scoring system they use in Malaysia amount to. This could be especially important, the standardization might be especially important because a lot of people argue it's the only check we have against rampant grade inflation. in a situation where the only measure of a student performance that we can use that's actually academic is grades in high school, then there's a huge incentive for teachers to just give really high grades. There's no reason for a school to just not ramp up their own grades significantly to make all of their students look better, and most studies indicate that grade inflation occurs predominantly in mostly white, mostly rich schools, which have much greater parental pressure to make sure students get really high grades. And so the lack of any standard mechanism to decrease the influence of grade inflation seems like it can have really perverse effects on the ability to have any standard mechanism by which we compare students in different learning environments. Last concern, second last concern, I don't know, one of the last negative arguments you'll come across is just efficiency arguments. It's really hard to make admissions decisions. It takes a lot of time. Where there are schools where you have tens of thousands of students applying and only 5 to 10 admissions officers to actually make decisions on who they're going to admit. You could just hire a huge number more people, but that is just a very expensive thing for schools to do. It means they have to have less resources elsewhere in programs, which might do a lot more good than so think about how much it would take to just eliminate one of the most efficient forms of admissions decisions. There's probably other things schools can do with that money to make the educational experience more valuable or more secure for students. Similarly, the more time you have to spend on looking at every single file, the less time you have to make decisions on the margin. So suppose there's some students who are just obviously qualified for the school, and some who obviously are not qualified. If you can make that decision really quickly, you can spend a lot more time deciding the difficult cases, which might be a more valuable use of your time than having to make a difficult decision about every single file, because there isn't any objective measure by which you can sort of make the assessments. Lastly, the negative can just argue, there are alternatives. This is what most of the articles seem to say. So even the articles that seem like apt articles, very few of them actually advocate eliminating the use of standardized tests. They recommend weighting it less, or making it optional, or only using a certain context, or changing the test that we use. And so it seems like there's lots of alternatives to eliminating the standardized test, which would fix a lot of the affirmative concerns, and that might retain some of the major negative benefits. The most common ones we'll see are, it seems, arguments that we should either only use certain tests. For instance, some scholars say we should only use SAT-2 tests and not SAT-1 tests, or only use them for certain populations, like international students, where we don't have any good way to make assessments other than with standardized testing. Adopting test optional programs, which we've talked about already. And lastly, reform how we use tests. The two reforms I've seen most commonly suggested are change how much we weight tests, just weight them a lot less. And second, adjust scores systematically. So if you know that students from certain ethnic minorities do X% worse and underperform white students on this particular amount, you could just artificially inflate those scores for the purpose of making a fair comparison, because you know, hey look, rich students just do better on the test because they can take it multiple times, so let's artificially deflate so that we get an accurate measure of student ability via these tests, and then you can sort of systematically account for what you might think the bias is, and that's going to be more positive information rather than just allowing individual judgments about school difficulty as the proxy to replace it with.
So next are some of the critical arguments that are on this topic. It's an interesting range of things because a lot of the literature can go either way, so I think methodology debates on this topic are going to be really interesting. It becomes the question of how you decide to use your affirmative or your negative to prove the thesis of whatever criticism you're reading. So for the affirmative, there are 3 arguments we're going to go over, but there are so many, honestly, because I think the chaos ground on this topic is just better. The first argument is that and this is a very intro-level criticism that anyone who wants to try K for the first time can go into, is the pedagogy oppressed by Paulo Freire. And essentially, he makes a Marxist class analysis about the colonized and the colonizers and how their relationship is shaped, especially in the context of the classroom, right? So he argues that current models of education treat students as vessels, not as individuals who are capable of agency, autonomy, or let alone critical thinking. And essentially, we need to move away from those models of education, and we must strive to treating students not just as people who are learning things, but are also co-creators of knowledge. As you can see, that becomes really difficult with standardized testing, which gives you multiple choice, which gives you one correct answer. It doesn't allow for you to produce knowledge as a student. It just requires that you regurgitate knowledge as a student, right? However, even though this was written in the 70s, clearly a lot of things have not changed, which means that it's your job to show how the affirmative is going to be different. 2 chapters in this book that are really interesting for you to look at is chapter 2, It explains the banking model, which is really prevalent in Freire's work, which talks about how education is an act of depositing, right? So children are treated as piggy banks, or anyone who's a student is treated as a piggy bank. And as this quote says, instead of communicating, the teacher issues communiques, it was translated from Portuguese, and makes deposits which the students patiently receive, memorize, and repeat. This sounds a lot like the ways in which people study for standardized tests. So you can easily apply a lot of his criticisms in the context of education and regurgitation of knowledge to this topic. And chapter 3 can help explain ways in which you can have an alternative or a different way in which we can understand education. He argues about dialogics, and this is the essence of education as the practice of freedom, one of cooperation, unity, creativity, and cultural synthesis, as well as organization, right? So he poses this as a more cooperative model, which speaks to kind of the Marxist origins that he is basing a lot of his critical theory off of, which means that all you have to do is talk about how standardized testing is not only consistent with the banking model, but you also need to show how a rejection or removal of standardized testing in the context of admissions allows for us to create spaces in which students can be more creative, right? And you can decide how you want to do this. You can decide, you can look at ways in which other schools that have gotten rid of admissions testing use things like portfolios, or people who don't focus as much on admissions testing, or colleges that don't pay attention to admissions testing get very diverse students who come from multiple backgrounds and can do a bunch of different things. Of course, this does also entertain the debate of why not make things optional, but if you talk about the ways in which standardized testing in particular forecloses our ability to reshape education, because as we saw in history, literally all of education is taught to teach towards the test, right? So kids get quizzed at younger ages, they take standardized testing all through elementary and high school because they know that colleges care about it. You can show that there's a causal relationship between standardized testing and the banking model specifically, and that can allow for you to kind of not necessarily avoid that debate, but take a different academic high ground in talking about what that means in the context of getting rid of testing in the context of admissions. The other thing that's really important is that when you're talking about the impacts for this criticism, you can talk about it in the context of teachers, and you can also talk about it in the context of students, right? So in the context of teachers, a lot of the impacts, and you won't necessarily find this in the context of Freire's work, some of it you will, but you should do additional research that's rooted in the topic. Teachers are not able to teach what they love teaching. They are not able to teach the things that they are qualified to do. They have to teach to the test. This also means that certain types of teachers are not really prioritized in schools anymore. We see less art teachers, less music teachers, less drama clubs. We see less educators who are invested in the critical thinking and creative thinking aspects of their students, and more towards things like STEM, or things that tests are actually going to be paying attention to. Likewise, we also see that effect on the students, and this is talked about in the Pedagogy of Repress, but you can also find additional evidence about this as well. When students aren't able to express themselves creatively, not only does this affect their ability to perform in college, but it also undermines their ability to exist as individuals who are capable of making decisions on their own, who are capable of relating to other people in ways that are not just matters of competition and quantitative analysis, but qualitative in the aspects of their life. Next is, there's a lot of ableism literature, spoiler alert and trigger warning, there's a lot of eugenics in the context of testing, like a lot. So if you pay attention to some of the history, just bringing those back a little bit, in 1905, we had Binet develop this standardized test in the context of intelligence, and even though his intention was not to necessarily weed out students in a way that was supposed to explicitly otherize these students, it ended up manifesting in that type of way, especially once it came to the United States. And this was replicated once again by the Stanford Binet test, as well as the IQ test that we see in the earlier parts of the 20th century. And specifically, we see as soon as these tests were no longer about how do we create different forms of learning for students who need it, but instead how do we keep them on track for what they are meant to do, or the types of jobs they are meant to have or not have, that's when you start seeing the manifestation of ableism in ways that are extremely problematic in determining the agency and the ability for individuals in the United States who are subject to this type of schooling system to be able to live their lives to the fullest, right? So in terms of ableism literature, an interesting scholar that you can look at in the context of this topic is J. Timothy Dolmage. And this is available online for free, has multiple chapters in it. I'm making references to chapters 1 and 2. But this quote, just to summarize it, is talking about how a lot of the roots of standardized testing are rooted in the eugenics movement. They were literally created in order to weed out people who were not able to contribute to humanity in ways that would allow for it to advance further. And once you take that type of paradigm, there's no reason we should still be looking at standardized testing because it still relies on that same logic in the first place. There are certain people who will test well and therefore deserve to go to certain colleges, deserve to have a certain type of future, and others can just figure it out on their own. And this author also talks about things like accommodations, because that's something that negatives will probably bring up. And he specifically refers to the educational reformist John Dewey, who says that the failure in education, a failure to learn one of the most important lessons of life, that is of a mutual accommodation and adaptation. Essentially, he was making the argument that there cannot be a standardized way of teaching kids, right? It's necessary to understand that there has to be some mutual correspondence in terms of the needs and the wants of the students. Standardized testing is inherently contradictory to that principle because it is standardized. There's one standard that everyone is supposed to meet, and that is the way that you take the test, and that's the way in which you look at results, and that's that. This undermines the ability for students with disabilities to not only be adequately accommodated, but it also creates this weird dichotomy between good students with disability and bad students with disability, because some people do well with the accommodations, i.e. you give them extra time for a test, or you let them stay in the room after everyone else is done, or you have them take it in a separate place. But other students might not do as well because it's not testing things that they either feel comfortable with, or it just takes them some time to learn things in the ways that they are standardizing education to be. This only ends up otherizing these students even though it claims to help them, right? So even if some students benefit from it, this argument is saying that by creating an otherizing model instead of a uniform model that recognizes that everyone has needs and everyone can have accommodations, you end up disenfranchising students with disability even more. Additionally, current accommodations, this lack of accommodation allows for the processing of teaching to also be really difficult. So then students who end up doing well are kind of seen as accidentally doing well rather than giving them the merit that they deserve. So then overall, it just creates a system that's really difficult for the students to be able to be seen as valid, and also undermines the kind of roots of standardized testing to show that it's always been exclusionary, which means you probably should throw the whole thing away, honestly. Next is arguments in the context of critical race theory, and it has the same logic behind it. There are a lot of really racist beginnings in the context of standardized testing. So the article that's up there is by John Rosales. It's published by the NEA. And it talks about eugenics again, but also remember the army test that I was talking about in the context of history. That is quite literally the root cause, or like the root of the model that a lot of standardized testing that we have today included. And those tests were not only just used to justify discrimination that black soldiers experienced, but it also explicitly was used to justify and accommodate the segregation between those different groups of people. So when you see students of these particular backgrounds struggling to take the test, it's because it's born of a legacy of segregation and discrimination anyway. Likewise, there's also arguments from specifically Jacqueline Fleming that from this article called Affirmative Action and Standardized Test Scores, that says that these tests have actually been used to impede social progress of African Americans for at least 2 centuries because of the scientific racism behind it, so eugenics as we just talked about, but also because the tests are used to justify treatment that they experience, right? So if it's a question of you are not capable, you are not able, you are not good enough, if any outcomes are associated with those things, it's just a matter of you didn't work hard enough, which is why you are in this position in the first place, which allows for society to continue to otherize these groups while using a test that was born to exclude them in the first place. Next, there's arguments on the negative that we'll quickly go over, but not as many. So it really depends on how you want to negate the topic. First, really easy one that you can use is go for a CAPK. The affirmative relies on underlying assumptions that deal with merit. And at the bottom, I have a definition of what we call meritocracy, which is a political system in which economic goods and other political power are vested in individual people on the basis of talent, effort, and achievement. Right? And you can go for this argument in two ways. One is that standardized testing is keeping out students who deserve to, the affirmative is arguing that it's keeping out students that deserve to be there. You can go for arguments about deserving and how this is often entrenched, and ideas of merit that say they are talented and therefore they should be there. And it creates this kind of standard of people who are deserving of goodness, who are deserving of mobility, who are deserving of a great brand from an institution, as was talked about in the other slides, which only allows for people to buy into a capitalist system in which those who are seen as poor in the context of education are not able to buy their way into the elite meritocratic class of the elite. And then the second way you can go for it is that college / universities, if someone makes the argument that they're key to equal opportunity, success, and ultimately the achievement of the American dream, you can make arguments about how the American dream does not exist. It's just a neoliberal idea that tells us that if you work hard enough, you'll get enough money to provide for your family and everything will be okay. When essentially there's lots of arguments and research that you can also do a quick Google search on, right? That say that people, for example, if you are an African American with a bachelor's degree, you can get less money than a white person with connections who just so happens to know someone at a good company. Which means that this understanding of if you work hard, you will be okay, only forces people to reinvest in a system that, one, was never made for them, but two, allows for capitalism to reign supreme because everyone is just buying into that system in the first place. Right? And then this is just another site that you can use. I'm not going to read the quote because you can have access to the slide, but if you want to look at the book, it's called The Tyranny of Meritocracy, Democratizing Higher Education in America. And this just talks about how the narrative of social mobility is used to kind of keep people trapped, and not really resist the ways in which this capitalist tradition has actually not worked for a bunch of people. Right? And then you can also, last argument we're going to talk about on the neg, is you can make an argument that's consistent with Foucauldian analysis. Foucault talks about a lot of things, right? Which means that you kind of have to be a little more specific about what you're talking about. In the context of this argument, is just talking about the relationship between schools and prisons. So if you look at that picture, it's showing a bunch of relations, right? And something that you should also notice is some people's schools might not be like that, but a huge majority, especially public schools, and especially in low-income areas, especially in places that are teaching to test, do actually look like that and do treat their students in that type of way. So if you want to have a specific book to start off with, you can look at Discipline and Punish by Michel Foucault. And he's drawing parallels that it's not surprising that prisons look similar to the ways in which our schools look. And this works really well with things like the pedagogy of the oppressed, which is why I was saying some of the app arguments could also be neg arguments, depending on how you decide to articulate them, because of the ways in which schools prioritize trapping people in one mode of thought. So you can use this to make a couple of arguments. You can make arguments like schools are institutions of moral and social regulation, which means that they not only force you to teach towards the test, but they also teach you how you're supposed to act in relationship to other people. If you're taught in school to not think critically, if you're taught in school not to question, you will also orient yourself to that in life. Which means that standardized testing also makes moral and social regulations as well really easy. But since you're negative, you also want to say that it's not just a question of how standardized testing does this, but standardized testing is more so a symptom of a larger problem, which is that our model of schooling is rooted in a prison-like mentality. Which means that the affirmative's focus on standardized testing not only obscures the issue, but it also probably buys into the analysis because it says, sure, we get rid of this, but we still have logics about education that say that there is one way to think about things. There's one way to analyze things. There's one way to engage in education that's still rooted in power and oppression. So that's a lot of information. We don't really have to.
Raise your hand if you have questions. Or raise your hand if you don't have questions, we'll want me to call on you to make them feel awkward. Yeah.
Simple, right? But it's also I guess, kind of giving people a solution to this kind of involvement, which numbers tend to be typology.
So Kant doesn't think that you can't assign numbers to people. Kant is not against weighing people in doctor's offices. or like checking your height. Sometimes you'll people talk about like don't turn people into numbers as though any numerical assessment of a person would be bad under a sort of standard human dignity. But if you think it's okay to like measure someone's height, then you probably also think it's okay to measure how much someone learns about a subject matter in a history class, or how well someone does on certain types of mathematical critical thinking skills. So it's not clear to me that Kantian deontology has any sort of principled reason to think standardized tests are good or bad. Kant does declare about things like forms of elitism in societies. He was kind of elitist, but it's not like he thinks elitism is a positive good. So I don't know. I don't think like Kant clearly affirms and negates. He's just like, you should look at what the evidence says and have good social policies based on considerations of what the democratic people in a society value. So I just don't think there's any clear reason to affirm and negate, just except independent of what all the other arguments are for one side or the other. Yeah.
I was reading like a democratizing education argument by like A.S. Neal, and I was wondering if that could be applicable to like the app or the neg. I wasn't really sure how that fit in the topic.
What's the argument?
I assume it's just there's no institutionalized schooling, and school is just community-driven things.
So
That sounds interesting.
right, like the app is the app is asking what should colleges and universities do to let in students. Perhaps what every single college has a moral obligation to dissolve itself and like no longer exist. Right? You might think that's what they should do. Anything besides that seems to be something that like colleges don't really have power over. Perhaps colleges should radically reform what they take education to be, in which case you might radically reform what admissions criteria care about in the first place so much that standardized tests would no longer make sense. But unless you can show that college and university should so radically change what education looks like and how they should train people that standardized tests would no longer have any valid evidence here, it's hard to know exactly what that would mean.
Yeah, I also think it depends on, like, if the scholarship was literally saying, like, get rid of institutions, or more so saying that we should have models of education that allow for a democratization of ideas, I feel like that can probably be a good framework for the affirmative, because then you can show how, like, standardized testing gets in the way of individuals being able to engage in educational models in that way, or schools otherwise, if they didn't have to teach towards tests because they're worried about their kids getting into a good college, would be able to form models of education that are that way. But otherwise, I don't think it has to be so radical in the sense that you have to literally dissolve it. Also, I'm not really sure why that would be affirming or like really in the scope of the topic.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you want to go that route, that's fine. Yeah.
Yep.
Do you think the USFG making a regulation on colleges and universities about standardized testing would be topical?
No.
No.
The topic does not say the US should do something. The topic says college and university should do something.
So really simple argument for this, right? You could imagine the following. You could imagine that the United States should pass a policy that says no more standardized testing, and that all colleges should ignore the law. Right? It's perfectly imaginable that there should be a law that says there should be no standardized testing for some like international signaling reason, and the colleges should still use standardized tests. So the fact that that is a possible situation which could be good suggests that showing that the United States should ban something just doesn't answer the question of the obligations of colleges and universities. Similarly, vice versa, you could say that there should be no law, but they shouldn't use it anyway. The fact that these can be totally decoupled from one another suggests that one advocacy just doesn't entail the normative implications of the other, which is required for topicality.
Oh,
Yeah.
you have a question over here.
Oh yeah, you.
Oh, no, it was like a similar
Okay.
question on like whether the app would be like multi-opportunity.
Oh, that's a good
Well, that's a
question.
different question.
Okay.
Let's answer that real fast. So the question is the affirmative multi-agent fiat? I think the answer is like, yeah, good point. Yeah, so for people who don't know what that means, so fiat is basically just the idea that when you're affirming, you're saying something should happen, right? Public colleges and universities ought to or should stop considering standardized tests, which means that considerations of would or will are irrelevant, right? The negative cannot just stand up and say, they're just not going to do that. So SATs, they're inevitable, because that wouldn't answer the resolutional question. So the affirmative does not need to answer practical considerations of will this happen. It does answer could it, and if so, should it, but not will it. Because a would question simply does not negate a should question or an ought question. Now, relevant consideration concerning fiat is what do you do when there's multiple different actors acting at the same time, right? In the real world, you might be in a situation where different people might need to coordinate, but no one agent has control over all the other agents, right? Think about like a prisoner's dilemma scenario or a tragedy of the commons, where sort of what we would all collectively want to do is different from what we all individually have reasons to do. And so one potential concern is like, you can't say something like, well, if we're all fighting over like the last, bit of common space and we're all shepherds in the classical tragedy of the commons, let's just all voluntarily agree to split it equally, because you have no ability to control the people. Now in this topic, there is a possible way I think you can interpret the topic that would look like that. It's like all colleges and universities should collectively decide simultaneously to stop using SAT and ACT tests and other standardized tests. And I think if you said that, then you might be running aground of some problematic conceptions of multi-agent fiat. Because then I could be like, how can they coordinate that? How could every other college know that everyone would do that? The colleges that decide to would just be the pariahs that, lose the students and things like that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that every affirmative agent is engaging in a problematic notion of multi-agent fiat, because that only happens if you're sort of advocating the collective action. They've all combined themselves and come to a unified consensus. You could say something like this. You could say, it is true for most or all colleges in the country that they have reason not to use standardized exit exams or standardized aptitude exams, whether or not other colleges do it. So for example, imagine you made the argument discussed earlier, like tests are biased, they're racist, they're ableist, etc. Would it matter to you whether all the other colleges are doing it? You'd be like, we shouldn't use this, period. And so you'd say, it is true that like Harvard should not use these tests, whether everyone else is doing it. And it is true that Yale should not use these tests, whether everyone else is doing it. And that's true for most colleges, then you would have affirmed, irrespective of whether there's some sort of illicit notion of cooperative fiat going on. Were there other hands that we haven't gotten to yet from the previous question?
Yeah, mine was.
Yeah, all right, so then you, and then you, and then you. All right, go for it.
Mine was very similar in that like multi-factor fiat, but also the resolution talks about like colleges and universities ought not consider standardized testing. So would that technically, would it be plausible to say that the app also engages in like a mindset shift fiat?
Mindset of the admissions office.
Yeah.
I guess, yes. Like, if you're an admissions officer in a college and you just like, by happenstance, learn the student's score or something, like they wrote it into like the extra section of the Common App, like, by the way, my SAT score is X. I guess the topic would conclude that you should just try to ignore that to the best of your ability. I mean, like, to that degree, I don't think it changes like the societal mindset writ large, but like the colleges and universities are in some sense changing orientation towards tests.
Yeah, so the literature seems like kind of side biased, and I think it puts the app in like a challenging spot of saying like literally no instance of the tests are good. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of like framing the impacts of the app to set up like why no instance of it.
I personally think that, well, Next might mess up, but I personally think that every regular app is probably gonna lose. I hate to say it, but I think that like if you're reading a soft left or like critical affirmative, it's a little bit more likely that your affirmative will make more sense, because if you're saying it's rooted in something that is just allowing for the entire thing to be bankrupt, it doesn't matter if you reform it, it doesn't matter if you change it, it doesn't matter if you make it optional, the fact that it's even a part of our process is bad. That seems pretty easy to be like, therefore throw the whole test away, right? But I don't think it's, I know I'm being dramatic, I don't think it's impossible for you to be affirmative and still win the topic. Like there's this Huffington Post article that people keep talking about that says that we should abolish standardized testing, but I also feel like as you kind of delve into the research a little bit more, if you also find disadvantages to making it optional or disadvantages to reforms that the negatives that are talking about, so you can start off with some of the picks and counterplans that were in the TA, that allows for the affirmative to have a fighting chance in talking about how, sure, you can do it, but it is not as desirable as just doing the affirmative and getting rid of it. And that's also another way you can kind of engage in that.
One other element I think to affirming here is, there's sort of two things that I think a successful affirmative want to do. One, if you want to have a straight up affirmative on this topic, you just need to know the statistics better than everyone else. Like this debate just has an incredible amount of stats to debate. It's just, there are so many studies, and the studies are very good. And there's like really interesting statistical questions about how we should interpret this data and literature. And I think there's a lot of possibility for someone to just like actually read up on how statistics work and how we should theorize about educational questions and be ahead on these debates. a lot of the negative articles are sort of funded by College Board and might have certain methodological problems that you can challenge. And so there are ways to sort of challenge some of the negative statistics. I do think the negative is probably true. Nevertheless, I think there are fairly solid ways, especially if you can add to this some sort of argument that says it's really impossible in a world where we have standardized tests to properly de-emphasize them. Even if college admissions don't pay that much attention to them, individual students will still fetishize tests, and individual schools will still in a way that just can't be avoided. And so I think there might be ways to increase affirmative impacts by claims about modeling, claims that high school curriculums in general model the SAT because that's what everyone aspires to, and parents obsess over the SAT, and students obsess over the SAT, and these sort of arguments say in a world in which the tests are used at all, you can't help avoid that obsession, are ways to increase the plausibility of the affirmative impacts that might hold up against the negatives.
My set of advice for the affirmative, I think, is on this topic, and this is true of a lot of topics, you probably want to have some diversity of offense. Like, we discussed two baskets of issues for the affirmative. There are the ones that are problems with the reliability of the test data, right? They're systematically biased in some way. And then there's the ones that are the problems with taking the test itself. And I think it would probably behoove most affirmatives to have some contention about both, because it makes it harder for the negative to propose one sweeping solution to all of those problems. So for example, the test optionality we've heard about a few times in this topic analysis, where colleges are just like, you can take the test if you want, but you don't have to, right? And on the one hand, that option does seem to resolve a lot of the problems with the intrinsic harms of taking the test. E.g. students that are just particularly high anxiety or feel like they couldn't perform well on the test, or students that are low income could simply choose not to take the test, right? So there's no intrinsic requirement to take the test. But on the flip side, test optionality could also exacerbate any sort of bias caused by standardized testing, because who's going to optionally take the test? Just the good test takers, right? And so opting out might put you at a further disadvantage, because the students who are opting out are the ones who are already bad at taking the test, or it could disadvantage the students who are taking the test, and now they're competing against a smaller group of only good test takers. You could argue that test optionality creates a further bias in the system that undermines the benefit. Now conversely, maybe your case is just about biases, right? Your entire app is about biases, so you're set up to answer test optionality well. And the negative comes back and says, all right, well, your problem is that like there could be biases in the test, e.g. that it doesn't test for enough information or enough types of knowledge, or that one single day could affect your entire career and you could be sick that day. And then the negative comes back and says, well, let's make the test longer, let's include more categories, include more subjective elements and so forth. Allow them to take it multiple times so that you can get like an average of scores to solve the problem of a single day. And that could solve some of the bias concerns, but then it ends up exacerbating some of the sort of intrinsic problems of what about students who can't afford to take it multiple times? What about students who are anxious, right? Having them take a bunch of tests is not necessarily better. Or very long tests might exacerbate people who have problems in testing environments. And so if you have that sort of set of problems, it becomes harder for the negative to point out the one thing that can solve all of those, because it would require a long list of possible alternatives or possible solutions to those sorts of things. And so I think having diversity of options allows you to pivot, say in the one AR, if the negative has a particularly strong solution to one that exacerbates another.
There was a question over here, I think. Not anymore? Okay.
So similar to like the whole as affirmatives, what are your thoughts on specification on this topic?
No.
Doesn't make any sense.
I don't like it.
Do you think like specifying like certain
Right, so there's three things the affirmative could in theory try to specify. Certain colleges and universities, certain tests for certain admission decisions. None of them topical.
You can try to fight for it, but I'm gonna just let you know, everyone get those theory shells and T-shells.
It would not be true that colleges and universities should not consider standardized test admission decisions if standardized tests, for instance, this would be like an absurd affirmative, I would think, okay? College and universities should not consider the GRE when testing undergrads because only college students take it for every grad school. Like, it's true. They should not consider the GRE or the LSAT or the MCAT when making admission decisions. That is indeed a standardized test. It doesn't seem relevant. Similarly, college and universities should not consider the SAT for students who only took the ACT. Like, that would be a really bad idea, but it doesn't seem to affirm the resolution. And it seems like anything that allows you to specify these principles would just make absurd apps topical all of a sudden, in a way that is definitely not true.
It's not what you do, it's what you justify. Remember that.
One minor caveat I will add is that, yeah, although the affirmative does seem quite general, I think one potential avenue where the negative could specify is it does seem right to say that if you could show a test that should be used, then that would negate. So you don't need to, again, you don't need to defend that every single test is used in the same way the app can't pick one test. The negative doesn't need to be like, here's a list of the 100 standardized exams that exist. ACT, SAT, LSAT, MCAT, GRE, and most of these being used, right? If you just showed that like the ACT and the SAT should be used, that's just 2 tests, right? And so it does seem that the negative advocacy of they should consider this particular type of test would be sufficient to negate. So that's the one instance where I think specification could be legitimate on the negative.
Like some people say only use SAT 2 tests, subject tests, for instance.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
What about the GED?
That's,
It's not really.
Is that a standardized test?
it's a standardized, but it's not for admissions.
Yeah, and I don't
Because you
know
don't use
any
it
colleges
for college.
use it.
Yeah, it's whether or not you get a high school equivalent, like an equivalent to a high school diploma. Not,
I don't know.
It depends. So I think. Wait. So I think it depends on whatever the affirmative. I think that doesn't really negate the first part of the question, which is just, hey, listen. I don't think it really negates the first part of the question, which is just that you probably should expect, if you want to spec to the GED, that's fine, and then just engage in that T theory debate. But I also feel like, as long as if the neg or AF is talking about that, if you prove that people also use that to get into college admissions, that could definitely be a really interesting debate, especially in the context of like class lines. But I think that's totally up to you. I think it probably is a good neg argument though.
Yeah, I think it'd be really worrying if the negative gets to say the fact that someone passed their GED, like the AF has to say you cannot consider that. So once you didn't graduate high school in a conventional way, you just have no way to convince colleges that you're qualified to enter school. Like that would be a really bad result. I assume, certainly as like the literature talks about it, no one is saying colleges can't consider the fact that you got a GED as relevant. And so like once you just didn't get your diploma the conventional way, you just have no way to convince colleges you have a high school level education. Though exactly why that is not clear.
There is a potential distinction that you might find between eligibility and admissions. So for example, you might say something like this, right? If you did not complete high school, you're not eligible to apply for college.
Yeah.
That is a different question than, once everyone has applied, who gets admitted? And so you could say, colleges should make high school diploma or equivalent a requirement to apply. E.g. the GED should be considered the purpose of, are you an eligible applicant? Even if colleges should not look at your GED score for deciding how good of an applicant you are. And so the affirmative could argue, like, yes, GED scores, just like every other standardized test scores, are not very useful for choosing the best students. And so the admissions office won't look at them. But it is still relevant to whether your application is a valid application in the first place.
Yeah, so I feel like if you're affirmative, you should probably, like, just in case someone does that, make sure you cut the distinction between eligibility and admissions. If you're neg and you want to make that argument, talk about it being kind of artificial. Based on our research, it seems like it's in the literature. We just don't know if that's like an official term of art or not. So you can also substitute that in the debates that you have.
Oh, and for anyone who's been confused, the GED is basically just the test you take if you did not actually graduate high school on your own to get like the diploma. You can take a test that's like the graduate equivalency degree, I think that's what it stands for. Is basically saying, I have the equivalent of a high school level knowledge, and so it functions like the equivalent of having graduated high school. Taking a test that's shown, even though you didn't actually graduate, you had that level of attainment. Yes?
Do you think there's any like extinction ground on this topic that isn't like absolutely ridiculous?
No.
I was like, imagine I was a college admissions officer, I'm deciding like, considering this number cause human extinction.
I mean, I should also make my answer more general, which is, on almost every topic, there is no legitimate extinction level scenario, even topics on which this is run. Right? The nuclear topic, even the nuclear weapons topic, I think probably does not have a plausible extinction scenario. So, yeah.
What are some fill apps that we could potentially read on this topic?
I think probably, as we were discussing a second ago, a lot of the classic philosophical debates you'll see in LD will be less applicable. E.g., it's not obvious what like Kantianism versus utilitarianism will say about exit exams. There's no like deep moral principle about like how to consider statistics. But there might be interesting aspects of educational philosophy. E.g., like Paulo Freire is a philosopher writing about philosophy of education, right? And you might find literature about questions of equity, social equity, or versus merit in educational institutions. And so I would suggest if you're interested in philosophical cases, try to find theories of education and how educators ought to act. You might find some interesting philosophical arguments that haven't been run on previous topics. But I don't think a lot of this, like especially not like the extinction first args or the government must be util args, are not going to be applicable to a what should colleges do topic. And so I think there's probably good philosophy ground. It's just not gonna be the same as what you're used to.
Yeah, I would also say this is a good opportunity for LDers to branch out in the context of like some of the philosophical frameworks that you have, because sometimes, like even though I talk about things in the critical section, these are still philosophers, right? There are still people that you can use to justify the frameworks for your cases. So you can still go for things being principally justified based on those frameworks. You just have to explain why that syllogism makes sense. Right?
Can I help you a little bit?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole section on philosophy of education.
Yeah.
Like Dewey was one really big example of this.
Yeah.
That if you start reading that literature, even if you write about education, can't speak to the specifics of that. So dig through that literature of philosophy of education, you'll find people who do framework arguments. I would also argue, like, if you, Jacob's slide about like what are the goals of college admissions, that's a place where there's some analysis that you can be doing about any kind of ethical obligations or like what perspective you should look at the topic from. Either do we look at it from an individual dessert conversation, or do we look at it from the perspective of what colleges want and what what achieves those goals or not, and whether or not standardized testing is at all relevant for that.
One possible person that might be relevant though, who's very much classical, would be Rawls. I think Rawls probably has a lot to say about constructing institutions like the college university system in a way that's equitable. So check out John Rawls.
Yeah. Maybe like 1 or 2 questions left, so that way we can go.
Jake, I was just going to suggest there's also a category on Phil papers that's just philosophy of education and has a lot of stuff and links to specific journals that are about ethics. And
yeah, check out philpapers.org, philpapers.org, and find the education section. You can read it.